The piercing scream of a horse tore through the pre-dawn silence, a sound so desperate it would make your heart stop. What could have provoked such terror in such a noble creature? The answer will surprise and chill you. Stay with us to unravel this mystery, and if you like it, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more emotional stories like this one. Could it be that the fog, dense and milky like a primordial broth, held within it more than just the biting cold of June and the smell of wet earth? For Michael, the mist that enveloped Foggy Hollow, his newly adopted refuge, seemed to carry omens, whispers of a past he tried to forget, and an uncertain future looming. That sharp whinny from Thunder, his chestnut Mangalarga marchador, wasn't a common call. It was an alarm, a primal scream that echoed through the sleeping valley, penetrating the wooden walls of the house and lodging directly in Michael's soul. At 38, he was a man under reconstruction. Architecture, his former passion and profession in New York, had become a source of exhaustion, a hungry monster that had almost consumed him. Nervous exhaustion, added to the recent and painful loss of his father, a central figure in his life, had pushed him to this forgotten corner of the world, a family inheritance that now represented both a sanctuary and a self-imposed prison. His eyes, usually calm and observant, carried the shadow of introspection and a persistent sadness. The kindness he showed to animals, especially to Thunder, was almost palpable, a stark contrast to the growing skepticism he harbored towards humans. Finding a new purpose, a new meaning to fill the void left by his old life and his father's absence, was his silent quest. The ranch, with its green pastures and riparian forests, was the stage for this journey. Thunder, more than an animal, was a silent confidant, an anchor in his sea of uncertainties. The horse, with its imposing presence and instinctive loyalty, represented a purity Michael felt had been lost in the world of men. The neighboring property, Murky Water Farm, was a dark counterpoint to this search for peace. It belonged to Walter Smith, a local businessman whose reputation was as murky as the waters of the river that gave his land its name. Walter was a middle-aged man, corpulent, with a cold, calculating gaze that seemed to evaluate everything and everyone in terms of profit or threat. His arrogance was notorious, as was his capacity to intimidate. The strange whinny from Thunder that June morning was the first sign that the tranquility of Foggy Hollow was an armed calm, fragile as glass. Michael ran barefoot across the dewy grass to the pasture. He found Thunder tense, ears pricked, nostrils flared, his body vibrating like a taut string, staring fixedly at the barbed wire fence that divided the properties. There was nothing visibly wrong. The sun was beginning to dissipate the mist, revealing the familiar landscape, but the horse's apprehension was contagious, a shiver that ran up Michael's spine. He tried to calm the animal, stroking its muscular neck, but Thunder remained restless, his eyes fixed in the direction of Walter's farm. It was then that Michael realized it wasn't just fear. It was as if Thunder detected a specific, invisible threat, a hostile emanation coming from those lands. This perception planted the first seed of an unease that would only grow. The morning mist, once a poetic veil, now seemed to hide real dangers, and the silence of the valley was no longer synonymous with peace, but with a latent tension. Michael felt the weight of solitude more acutely. Who would believe him if he said his horse sensed evil? In the weeks that followed, Michael tried to shake off the sense of foreboding. He attributed Thunder's reaction to some wild animal, perhaps a stray peccary or a puma prowling. But the image of the horse on high alert, the sharp whinny, persisted in his mind like an echo. The beginning of July brought sunnier days, but the shadow of Murky Water Farm hung over him, invisible and oppressive. One afternoon, while riding with Thunder along the property line, Michael witnessed a scene that confirmed his latent fears. Walter Smith, mounted on a dark, sturdy horse, was riding his land. Suddenly, he stopped and, with shocking brutality, pulled back hard on his animal's reins, accompanying the gesture with a harsh shout. Walter's horse reared, clearly frightened and in pain. The gratuitous cruelty of the gesture, the way Walter seemed to extract pleasure from the animal's submission, disgusted Michael. Thunder beside him stopped short, whinnying softly, a sound of protest and discomfort. That incident, seemingly minor, was a subtle but significant turning point. Michael's unease transformed into a palpable aversion to Walter. The threat that Thunder had sensed seemed to have a face, and it was ugly and cruel. Michael began to observe the movements on the neighboring farm more closely, his ears more attuned to the sounds coming from there. Michael's solitude was a skittish animal, shrinking at the slightest sign of approach, but his concern for the well-being of his own animals, and now for what was happening beyond the fence, began to push him out of his shell. He remembered the stories his father told about the region, about unwritten codes of honor among rural landowners, a mutual respect for the land and neighbors. Walter seemed unaware of or deliberately ignored such codes. In mid-July, a new element appeared at Foggy Hollow. One night, Michael heard a weak bark, almost a whimper, coming from near the tool shed. With a flashlight, he found a thin dog with dark fur and frightened eyes huddled under a shelf. It was a mixed-breed dog, clearly mistreated, with visible ribs and a recent wound on its paw. Michael, despite his growing skepticism towards strangers, even four-legged ones, felt a pang of compassion. He left some water and food scraps, keeping his distance. In the following days, the dog stayed nearby, always wary, but gradually accepting the food. Michael named him Spark, for the spark of life that still shone in his suffering eyes. Thunder, surprisingly, seemed to accept the new resident with a curious calm, as if he understood that Spark also was a soul seeking refuge. Spark's arrival was a subtle but important turning point. Caring for the injured dog gave Michael a focus, a small distraction from his worries about Walter and his own melancholy. Slowly, Spark began to trust, wagging his tail timidly when Michael approached, following him at a respectful distance during his walks around the ranch. Canine loyalty, pure and unconditional, began to warm a forgotten corner in Michael's heart. By the end of July, a strange smell began to emanate from the creek that snaked through a part of Foggy Hollow, a creek whose source was on the lands of Murky Water Farm. It was a chemical odor, acrid, that irritated the nostrils. Shortly after, Michael found some dead fish floating on the surface, their silver bellies turned upwards. Thunder, when taken to drink water there, balked, sniffing the current with suspicion. Spark, who used to cool off in the creek, also avoided the water, growling softly at it. This was a medium-impact turning point. Michael's suspicion intensified. Walter wasn't just cruel to his animals, he seemed to be poisoning the land. Thunder's instinct, Spark's fear, everything pointed to something nefarious happening on the neighboring property. The apparent tranquility of the countryside was unraveling, revealing a hidden rot. Michael felt a mixture of riva and impotentia. His desire for peace was being actively sabotaged. He needed to do something, but what? Confronting Walter directly seemed risky. The man was powerful and, Michael intuited, dangerous. The rustling of dry leaves under his boots during his rides with Thunder no longer sounded like music, but like the whisper of dark secrets. The sunlight, which once warmed his face and brought a promise of renewal, now seemed only to illuminate the growing threat. Michael's faith in starting over in that place was being brutally tested. August arrived with its dry days and winds that swept the valley, carrying with them the persistent smell of the contaminated creek. Michael, increasingly worried, decided he could no longer ignore the situation. Armed with a courage he didn't know he possessed, and with the image of the dead fish and his animals' reluctance to approach the water as motivation, he rode to the gate of Murky Water Farm. Walter received him on the porch of his large house, an imposing but poorly maintained mansion that seemed to reflect its owner's soul. Michael explained his concerns about the creek, trying to maintain a neutral but firm tone. Walter listened with a mocking smile on his lips. He denied any responsibility, suggesting Michael might be imagining things, or worse, that he was too incompetent to take care of his own land. "Are your animals sick? Maybe the problem is you, big city architect," Walter said, his voice heavy with contempt. He ended the conversation with a veiled threat. "Mind your own business, and I'll mind mine. And don't meddle where you're not called, or you might regret." "Doofu," That confrontation was a medium-impact turning point. Michael returned to Foggy Hollow with a heavy heart and the certainty that Walter was guilty and dangerous. The conversation not only hadn't solved anything, but it had placed him directly on the neighbor's radar. Helplessness transformed into cold determination. If he couldn't count on Walter's cooperation, he would have to find another way to prove what was happening. His goal of protecting his home and his animals now faced a clear and intimidating obstacle. Solitude, previously a melancholic companion, now became a burden. He needed help. But whom could he trust? The skepticism towards humans planted by his experiences in the city bloomed bitterly in the countryside. In September, the nights grew colder. Michael, unable to sleep, began keeping night watches, observing the property line with Murky Water Farm. Spark, now his inseparable companion, stayed by his side, ears alert to any noise. On one of those nights, under the pale light of the waning moon, Michael heard the muffled sound of a truck engine coming from the direction of Walter's farm, in a dense wooded area near the creek. The sound was unusual for that hour. With Spark trotting silently beside him, Michael approached the fence as much as he could, hiding among the trees. He managed to spot, in the distance, flashlight beams and the outline of men, unloading what appeared to be large barrels from a truck. He couldn't see details, but the clandestine scene in the middle of the night confirmed his worst suspicions. That was a major turning point. Walter wasn't just being negligent, he was actively engaged in some illegal activity, probably the disposal of toxic waste. The danger was much greater than Michael had imagined. The tension at Foggy Hollow became almost palpable. Thunder grew agitated whenever he felt the wind coming from the direction of the neighboring farm, and Spark growled low at the darkness, as if sensing the presence of evil. Michael began to document everything he saw and heard: dates, times, odors, the condition of the creek. He felt like an amateur detective in a dangerous plot, where every small discovery increased the risk. The search for a new purpose was taking an unexpected turn. He found himself compelled to fight not just for his peace, but for the integrity of that small piece of land he had learned to love. The memory of his father, an upright man and nature lover, spurred him on. He couldn't let Walter destroy that legacy. The heat of the sun, which once seemed to scorch his hat during his work on the ranch, now seemed insufficient to dissipate the cold in his soul, a cold that came from fear and uncertainty. Hope, however, still resisted, fueled by Thunder's loyalty and Spark's constant presence. In October, Michael decided to seek help. He remembered Mr. Joe, an old resident of the region, known for his wisdom and knowledge of local stories. His father had mentioned him a few times with respect. Michael found him in his small house, a simple but cozy ranch house, surrounded by a well-kept orchard. He told him his suspicions, showing his notes. Mr. Joe listened attentively, smoking his straw pipe, his experienced eyes fixed on Michael. The old man didn't seem surprised. He spoke about Walter's greed, about other suspicious incidents in the past, rumors that were never proven. He mentioned a code of honor among the old farmers, a respect for the land and neighbors that Walter seemed to have come to break. These kinds of people respect nothing, my son. Only money and power, Mr. Joe said, his voice grave. Then he got up and, from an old wooden chest, took out a yellowed map of the region, much more detailed than modern maps. He showed Michael old, almost forgotten trails that cut through the woods and could lead to discrete observation points of Murky Water Farm. Use it carefully, and remember, the truth has its price, the old man advised. The conversation with Mr. Joe and the map was a medium-impact turning point. Michael was no longer completely alone. He had gained a discreet ally and a valuable tool. Michael's faith in finding justice, which had wavered, received a small breath of life. He felt that the light, however weak, could still break through the darkness. In early November, tragedy almost struck Foggy Hollow. Thunder, after drinking water from a puddle that had formed near the fence, where contaminated creek water sometimes overflowed after heavy rains, became seriously ill. The horse was apathetic, refusing food with tremors and a high fever. Michael, desperate, called the veterinarian from the neighboring town. The diagnosis was grim: intoxication. The veterinarian couldn't state the exact cause without complex analysis, but suspicion fell on the contaminated water. For days, Michael cared for Thunder with total dedication, spending sleepless nights by the animal's side, administering medication, trying to comfort him. Spark didn't leave his side, lying at Michael's feet as if sharing his anguish. Seeing Thunder, his imposing and loyal companion, reduced to a state of extreme fragility, was a devastating blow for Michael. This was a major turning point. Walter's threat had ceased to be abstract and had become painfully personal. Michael's anger and determination reached a new peak. He wouldn't rest until he exposed Walter and his criminal activities. The cost of his search for peace was becoming too high. Fear was a cold claw squeezing Michael's chest, but the sight of Thunder suffering ignited a protective fury in him. He would use Mr. Joe's map. He would get the evidence, no matter the cost. Thunder's slow and painful recovery over weeks served as a constant reminder of Walter's cruelty and the urgency of the situation. Michael, now driven by righteous fury, intensified his investigations. Using the trails indicated on Mr. Joe's map and always accompanied by Spark, whose sharp senses were an invaluable early warning system, he began to approach the wooded area where he suspected the illegal dumping was occurring. The smell of chemicals was stronger there, and the soil seemed stained in some spots. On a night in mid-November, taking advantage of the darkness and a fine rain that muffled sounds, Michael and Spark crept to an observation point that offered a clear view of a hidden clearing inside Murky Water Farm. What they saw confirmed his worst fears. Walter was there, supervising two henchmen who were dumping the contents of barrels directly into a ditch dug in the earth, which would clearly drain into the creek. Michael, his heart pounding uncontrollably, pulled out his cell phone and began taking photos and recording videos, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He needed that evidence. Suddenly, one of the henchmen seemed to hear something. Michael froze. The man began walking towards him, a powerful flashlight sweeping the darkness. Michael was about to be discovered. It was then, in the moment of greatest danger, that Spark exploded into action. The small mixed-breed dog, who until then had been growling hidden behind Michael, launched himself like a dark arrow at the nearest henchman, biting his calf furiously. The man howled in pain and surprise, letting go of Michael to try and get rid of the dog. The second henchman tried to kick Spark, but the dog was too agile, esquivándose and attacking again, now towards Walter, who had recoiled in fright. Spark's fierce barks echoed through the woods, a sound of pure protective fury. Spark's intervention gave Michael the precious second he needed. He regained his balance and, taking advantage of the confusion, fired the hunting rifle into the air. The shot boomed through the night, an alarm signal that he hoped someone would hear. Walter, seeing that the situation had gotten out of control, and with the sound of the shot echoing, hesitated. It was enough. Headlights appeared on the dirt road leading to the ranch. They were the cars of the environmental police and the civil police, accompanied by Mr. Joe, who, sensing the danger, had contacted the authorities and insisted they act that night, using the copies of the evidence Michael had given him. Walter and his henchmen, caught red-handed with the toxic barrels and now with the attempted assault on Michael, had no way to escape. They were arrested right there, under the trees that had witnessed their crimes. The tension slowly dissipated, replaced by exhausted relief. Michael knelt and hugged Spark, the dog's fur still bristling, his small body trembling with adrenaline. "You saved me, buddy. You saved me," Michael whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The small dog, whom he had rescued from the brink of death, had returned the favor heroically. That act of canine courage was the final turning point, the most impactful of all. The light of justice finally had broken through the darkness. The months that followed, Foggy Hollow began to breathe a sigh of relief. Walter Smith and his accomplices were prosecuted and convicted for the environmental crimes and attempted assault. Murky Water Farm was shut down, and a long process of environmental recovery for the creek and contaminated soil was initiated. The news spread through the region, and Walter's already dark reputation completely collapsed. Many local residents who had previously feared the businessman came to thank Michael for his courage. He who had come to the valley seeking solitude and anonymity found himself, reluctantly at first, at the center of a small community that was rediscovering its voice and strength. Mr. Joe became a friend and mentor, sharing stories and teachings about the land and its traditions. The old country store in the village, which had been somewhat forgotten, became a meeting point again, where people exchanged news and planned initiatives to protect the local environment, inspired by Michael's case. The code of honor of the Yadi old farmers, based on mutual respect and care for nature, seemed to be rising from the ashes. Michael, in turn, underwent a profound transformation. The nervous exhaustion and the pain of losing his father were still part of his story, but no longer defined him. The fight to protect his home and his animals, the need to face his fears and the threat represented by Walter, had awakened in him a strength and purpose he didn't know he possessed. Architecture, previously a source of anguish, began to reintegrate into his life in a different way. He started designing small projects for the community, a new bridge over the now clean creek, a sustainable community center, using his talent to build, not to isolate himself. Thunder fully recovered his health and vitality, his morning whinnies returning to being a joyful greeting, not an alarm. They rode together through the green pastures, the shadow of Murky Water Farm now just a distant memory of a danger overcome. And Spark, the unlikely little hero, became Michael's loyal shadow, a living symbol of the courage and loyalty that can emerge from the most unexpected places. The dog, previously a frightened mixed-breed dog, now walked with confidence, his tail always wagging, his bright eyes fixed on his human. The relationship between Michael, Thunder, and Spark was proof that the strongest bonds are often forged in adversity. Michael's faith, previously shaken, found a new foundation. Not blind faith, but a belief in the ability to make a difference, in the strength of community, and in the purity of animal instinct. The light he had sought so much was not in a distant place, but within him, reflected in the eyes of his animals and the grateful faces of his neighbors. Hope, once a tiny, fragile seed, now bloomed like a resilient flower in the soil of his soul, irrigated by justice and love. Foggy Hollow, which had once been the stage for his solitude and a dark threat, had truly transformed into a refuge, not of isolation, but of connection, healing, and a new beginning full of meaning. Michael looked out at the valley, now bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, and knew he had found his place, his purpose. And it had all begun with the sharp whinny of a horse and the silent courage of a small dog named Spark.